They were not supposed to survive. 2 pilots, 2 tired engines, and 60 enemy fighters already circling the sky like sharks. No backup. No radar. No escape route. High above the Pacific, Japanese Zeros filled the horizon so many that one American pilot later said it looked like the sky itself had turned hostile. And yet Command sent them anyway. Because sometimes war does not ask if you can win. It only asks how long you can delay the inevitable. What happened next would become one of the most terrifying air battles of the Pacific War. A fight so desperate that one pilot's engine failed the exact second he touched the runway. If it had died even 1 second earlier, he would have gone straight into the jungle, or into the ocean, or into Japanese hands. This is the true story of the mission no one expected to come back from. The war had turned against them. By mid-1943, the Pacific War was no longer a clean battle of fleets and formations. It had become a grinding, brutal struggle of attrition. Airfields were carved out of jungle mud. Pilots slept beside their planes. Engines were patched with scrap metal and hope. The Japanese still controlled large sections of the sky, especially over contested islands where American bombers were constantly hunted. And on one of those islands, remote, undersupplied, and barely holding on, an urgent radio call went out. Enemy aircraft had been spotted. Not a patrol, not a scouting force, a mass formation. Over 60 Japanese fighters, most of them Mitsubishi A6M-0s, were heading straight toward a vulnerable American position. The base had almost no defense left, and the response from command was chilling. We can only spare 2 fighters. 2 against 60. Even the ground crew froze when they heard the order. This wasn't strategy. It was sacrifice. The 2 men selected were not rookies. They were experienced but exhausted. One had already flown dozens of combat missions. The other had survived crashes, mechanical failures, and near-miss dogfights. They flew aircraft that were already worn down, engines overheating, oil pressure unstable, fuel lines patched and repatched. These planes were not meant for heroics. They were meant to buy time. As they climbed into their cockpits, neither pilot asked why. In war, orders didn't come with explanations. They only came with consequences. One of the pilots quietly checked his gauges and muttered, "If the engine holds, maybe." That maybe was the most optimism anyone had. The runway was short. The air was heavy. The engine screamed in protest. As the 2 fighters lifted off, ground crew watched in silence. Not cheering, not waving. They had already said goodbye. Climbing through the clouds, the pilots could see distant specks forming lines in the sky. Then the radio crackled. Bandits, multiple, too many to count. 60 Japanese fighters were approaching in layered formations. High cover, mid-altitude escorts, and fast interceptors diving from above. The Americans were already outnumbered 30-1. There would be no traditional dogfight, only survival. The first Zero came down like lightning. The American pilot barely had time to roll before tracer fire ripped past his canopy. The second pilot shouted a warning, then broke formation. Immediately, Japanese fighters swarmed. The sky became chaos. Gunfire stitched the air. Engines roared. Metal screamed. The Americans fought smart, not bravely. They used vertical dives. They used speed. They refused to turn fight Zeros, knowing they'd lose instantly. Every second they survived was a second the base below had to prepare. One Japanese fighter exploded mid-air, then another. But for every enemy hit, 5 more replaced it. The radio filled with breathing, fast, panicked, controlled only by training. Halfway through the fight, one pilot noticed something terrifying. Oil pressure dropping, temperature rising. His engine was failing, not damaged by gunfire, just worn out. The kind of failure no amount of skill can stop. He told his wingman. The reply was short. "Get out! I'll cover." But getting out meant flying straight through 60 fighters. And the Japanese knew it. They smelled weakness. They chased. The damaged fighter dove low, skimming the ocean. Zeros followed, firing relentlessly. Bullets tore holes in the wings. Fuel leaked. The engine coughed. Every mile felt like a miracle. Back at the base, ground crews watched the horizon, counting seconds. They expected smoke. They expected nothing. Then, a speck. The pilot's hands shook as the engine sputtered harder. He whispered to it, begged it, promised it rest. The wheels touched the runway. The second they did, the engine died. Completely. No sputter, no warning. Silence. The plane rolled to a stop like a dead animal collapsing after one last step. Ground crew rushed forward. The pilot sat frozen, realizing something horrifying. If the engine had failed 1 second earlier, he would have crashed short of the runway. 1 second later, and he might have rolled into fuel trucks. 1 second earlier, and he would have been dead. He climbed out slowly, legs barely holding him. Above, the sky was still filled with enemy fighters, and only one American was left up there. The second pilot fought alone now. 60 against 1. He didn't try to win. He tried to annoy. He made diving passes, forced enemy fighters to chase him away from the base. He burned fuel recklessly. Every maneuver was borrowed time. Finally, low on ammunition, fuel nearly gone, he dove for home. Japanese fighters followed, but peeled off. They had done their damage elsewhere. He landed. His engine survived, but barely. The base survived. Barely. Supplies were saved. Personnel evacuated, damage minimized. No medals were awarded immediately. No headlines were written, because stories like this weren't about glory. They were about holding the line. Years later, one pilot said, "They didn't send us to win. They sent us to delay death." For decades, this mission barely existed outside of after-action reports. No dramatic photographs, no victory parade, no famous ace interviews. Just a few typed pages describing a delaying action and successful defensive response. But those cold words hid the truth. Because the real battle didn't happen only in the sky. It happened inside the cockpit. Inside the moment when a pilot knows his engine is dying, but still pushes it harder. Inside the second when you realize no one is coming to save you. The men who planned the mission understood something brutal. If those 60 Japanese fighters reached the base at full strength, hundreds of lives on the ground would be lost. So instead of protecting 2 pilots, they spent 2 pilots to protect hundreds of others. That decision weighs heavy, especially when you remember that those pilots were not volunteers for death. They were professionals who followed orders, knowing exactly what the odds were, and still took off. Part 11. The weight they carried after the war. Years later, one of the pilots was asked a simple question at a reunion. "Weren't you scared?" He paused for a long time. Then he said something unexpected. Fear wasn't the problem. The problem was knowing how little difference we could make, and flying anyway. After the war, both pilots returned home. They married. They worked ordinary jobs. They rarely talked about the mission. But some nights the memories came back. The sound of engines, the way the sky filled with enemy aircraft, the feeling of an engine dying beneath you while the ground rushed closer. One of them admitted he still dreamed about that landing. Not crashing, not burning, just the silence when the engine stopped, after he was safe. Because that silence reminded him how close the world had come to ending. Not in flames, but in inches, in seconds. Final outro, deep emotional ending. History loves heroes who win, but war is often shaped by those who are sent, not to win, but to hold on. 2 pilots were sent against 60 fighters, with no promise of survival. 1 engine died, the exact moment it was allowed to. 1 second earlier, this story would not exist. And that is the terrifying truth of war. Sometimes survival is not about skill, not about bravery, not even about luck. Sometimes it is about staying alive, just long enough for fate to look away. And when it does, you land, you breathe, and the world keeps turning, even though it almost didn't.